Hi, how are you? It's Michael, and we've talked a lot about big picture stuff in terms of information architecture, all these lofty ideas about how we turn data into knowledge, but now we're actually going to get into the nitty gritty of how do you do it. And this is where all the fun starts because, at least in my experience teaching this, everyone's going to have a different approach to it. And every time one does something, in my mind, you actually will learn something through success or failure or even frustration. Things will often start to click together. There's nothing like experience. I know it's very tempting to say that somehow what I've experienced will go right into you and you will be able to apply it, but that's not going to happen. You're going to have to try it. But I think there is, people are worried about that. They don't want to necessarily go in and struggle with something. So let me see if I can get you started in some easy ways. And I think data is one of the harder ways for someone who's a designer like myself. I like to think at least as much as human as possible. And data can be very inhuman. It can be, it's not necessarily friendly. So what are we looking at right now? We're looking at some data, and where does data even begin and start? One of my favorite conceits when it comes to computers, at least as we're used to them now, I started working on a computer when it was a command line, which had a lot of issues when it came to how do you navigate this space, because it didn't really have any analog to the physical world. It was all very computery. So you could get used to it, and those of you who are used to the terminal or things like that within your computer realize that it all runs kind of on that in that level, and we just put layers on top of it to make it more understandable. So my example here is I always love seeing this concept, some of the UX concepts that we've come up with, like the desktop, and how they're really used by people. And the reason I'm showing this is just to prove all these things are data. They're folders with files and all these conventions that we've come up with to make computers easy to use. But they are structured in a way that's idiosyncratic to the person using them. So this desktop to me is sort of that, here's everything on earth, and I don't want to take time to give it any structure because whatever, it's not worth it. It's not your skill set or whatever. So this, not to point out that people who are organized or disorganized have any virtues or lack of. It's just that I love this because it's not, this is unstructured data. Okay, so it is data. It is absolutely probably extremely valuable and useful to this person, yet for another person it is unstructured such that it cannot be used. And that to me is why everyone should be in the business of being, if you like it, an information architect. Because unstructured data is very idiosyncratic and it's useless. It is human, meaning if you ask this person for some piece of data in here, they could probably find it. I personally, even as much as I attempt to be organized, find it extremely challenging to take years and years and years of files and ideas and etc. and make any sense of them at all. I think we're all in that situation where there's just too much to organize and it is time consuming. So how do you do it? And that's what I want to get into today by just showing the kind of route. Let's say this is a little bit easier to come up with. I just came up with a couple of data sets that are, well, let's talk about them. First of all, they're in a table format, and a table format is an illusion. Let me make that clear. I have nothing but contempt really for Excel, except for what it was made for, which is to apply formulas and different macros and other sort of transformational ideas to bunches of numbers. And again, that's perfect. If you're doing actuarial work, if you're doing anything to do with manipulating or understanding numbers, Excel is your best friend. I happen to deal mostly in the world of not numbers. We'll get to numbers, later, because they have their own special set of tools that we use to understand numbers as humans. But this is more textual data. It's a bunch of things, and what it is actually structured. So here's, I think, always a good example, if I can go in here, this is a playlist. The playlist is song-based, so that's one thing that we might understand for many reasons. The concept of a song. Songs have titles, let's hope. So these are worlds unto itself, naming conventions, etc. But let's just say that we all might understand this word name, or we could say song title. There's an artist. Okay, great. Is that a visual artist? No, it's a music artist, but we use the term artist. So there's words, we call them name value pairs. And this is where I want everyone to feel confident, right? Okay, there's a value, we're going to call it a label, or we can call it whatever, and then there's a value inside of it that changes. Perfect. So far, data makes sense. Here's a concept called composer. Hey, that works for some things. So now we start to see actual empty values. One of the most fun, and the reason why you're going through this, now someone might give you this, or you might go, I just downloaded it somehow. But we start with data. And this is something I think that we miss out on sometimes in the design realm. A lot of times we start with, just trying to design an interface without really studying or understanding the data underneath of what this interface is meant to interact with or contribute to. Because the best thing you could ever do is come up with forms where people contribute data, and forms don't have to be empty, blank boxes. The forms can take on all sorts of shapes and sizes. Anyway, that gets data from people that then they find useful, and then in aggregate, meaning the more you get, the more useful it gets. So if we look back to the person's desktop, there's a lot of data that may or not be useful for them. To make data useful within an enterprise or within a small to medium to large company is really a big challenge. It's something that people spend a lot of time doing manually and not repeatably. I mean, they might get better at it, but automation of repetitive tasks is kind of why I got into this business. I'm not a repetitive task fan. I find it difficult to do what some people would call hard work, which is just doing something that's repetitive and it really doesn't have much variation with it. Those sort of things just always bothered me. I like novelty. I like to let the computer do it, which is actually why we're here. The computer is pretty good at that kind of repetitive stuff. So good at it that it's almost mind-boggling how simple at root computer processors are. They really are only doing sort of combinations. They're a bunch of light switches, basically. But you can make them, through all that repetition, do things that actually seem worthwhile. Good job. So back to looking at this. So we once, this is often called nulls. You're looking for nulls. Nulls in a database are very, very, very challenging because often they have meaning and often they have no meaning. So as you're beginning here, you're trying to look at data and you're trying to kind of scratch your head saying, okay, what would I do with this data? Would I need to display it? Is it interesting at all? What does the word composer mean? But hey, album, wonderful. Now we've got a name that there's this concept of an album, which is a collection of songs. Almost literally comes from the big books that they used to put all these things in, the album of like a picture album of songs. So anyway, an album now is just probably just more like a grouping of songs. And here's this word grouping. Grouping, as you can see here, is almost always null, but sometimes, for whatever reason, this word grouping might come in handy. So I want you to understand, we're actually kind of puzzling through this. I don't know what the word work means. I'm taking a data model, by the way. All these words, name value pairs, are called a data model. And data models, thankfully, they're malleable. That's all you need to know. They don't have to look like this. We don't have to have all these fields. This just happens. Some have been added over time. Changing data models can be tricky, but that's fine. Again, there's nothing really hard about coming up with a new field in a database. So that's one thing while you're looking at this data, as you're trying to think of what's interesting, how could I organize this, how would I display this to be useful, and what situations would it be useful? That's what you need to do. So back to this movement number, movement count. We're almost using words here, movement name. This looks to me a lot like how the challenge of doing classical music, which is you've got a performer, you've got a composer, you've got all these concepts that may or may not be as relevant to a singer-songwriter who is the performer, the author, etc. They do all of it. Whereas this is, just being able to keep track of conductors could be tricky. I wonder if that's even in here. Genres. This is probably the most important field so far. So we'll come back to it in a second. These sort of data, sizes, timings, sure, these are great. Data, discount, track numbers. Any numeric information is good, yet it's going to be problematic because, there's two things. Is it significant the year this song was released? So actually, I would probably call this release year. Well, you've probably thought in your head, okay, wait, records can get re-released. What does this year mean? How many years could they be? So this is one thing where you have to be a little bit careful. This could be multiples, but certainly music that was created in particular decades might be appealing to someone. So you might want to say, hey, I'm just going to come up with random songs that were all recorded in 1971. Good year for music, right? So here's a bunch of 1971 songs at random. As long as this field is reliable, you've got yourself maybe the beginning of some interesting value proposition to someone. Dates could be important. Year and date could be important. When you start to see this kind of format, you want to be aware that this might be more specifically interesting to another concept we'll get into in a second, which is going to be about uniqueness. Things shouldn't necessarily be they cannot in a database be identical. That's one rule that you've got. You've got a thing, you cannot have duplicates because that would A, be confusing, and B, which is the right one. Computers just don't like that. Now, you can have two records that are exactly the same, but something has to be different between one and the other. Perhaps that could be time. That's a fun field to throw in there, or just a random number is another good example of, hey, we're just going to throw something in there that we know will always be unique, but not necessarily meaningful. So just, kind of get yourself through this. Bit rate might be interesting. As sample rate, these might have a lot more to do with another use case, right? What kind of formatting or file is it? And then this is some personal fields that they're keeping. And that's actually a really big part of our experiences online now, is that once you've created identities with different services, they can start to keep track of stuff like this. When was the last time you played this? When was the last time, or skipped is even a more interesting thing, because a lot of times people think, well, if you skip it, you didn't like it. Again, these are just ways to keep track of something that you might want to use later to sort a list. And I think I was getting at this, and I think I will get at it. Sorting and grouping. So we saw a thing here that grouped by something idiosyncratic, but there was this thing called genre. This is probably the most important field right now for the information architect, because you start to see repetition. So in this case, depending on what the word genre means, in this case, classical, rock, jazz, etc., perfect. You've got a word that will start to group these records together. So if I had 10 records, it doesn't really matter. You don't need to have a lot of groups. You could just put it in alphabetical order. How many times have you gone in to pick a country, of what country you're in? And sorry, I am in the United States, and I'm really always disappointed that it comes last in the alphabet, because it's always sorted alphabetically. So an alphabetical sort is fine, because it's fine. People understand what the alphabet is, I hope. But it isn't convenient, meaning, alphabetically, the most important thing could indeed be last on the list. So that's where, as an information architect, you have to be a little bit concerned, because a directory list of people in a building alphabetically makes a lot of sense. There isn't really any value proposition to one person's name over the other. And someone's trying to find a name, they don't want to have to go through all of them based on any other attribute. So it makes a lot of sense. We've got the Nakatomi building, you're trying to find somebody in it. Where are you? Alphabetically worked for so many years when it came to Yellow Pages, triple A, anything, even Apple Computer. Things starting with early in the alphabet tended to get more attention because alphabetical was probably your best way of sorting data, and that architecture, so to speak, can be gamed. Maybe people didn't want to start their business name with Z. Or if so, they probably wanted to start it with ZA, so the minute you opened up to Z's, you were at the very beginning. Zap something. Anyway. But you get it. You have to understand the organizational structure of how your information is going to be seen, and once you understand the organizational structure, you can exploit it. You're at the opposite end. You're an information architect. Your job is, well, how many ways could I provide value? So right now, in this example, we know that one important aspect here is that you've got some field that allows you to group. And I do want to use the word grouping or clustering because things grouped around a similar name give you a lot more freedom to explore different display options. You've got some time, which could, in a sense, like the year released, could be interesting in terms of a sort because you can sort by number and you can group by genre. And then lastly, the things that you can also group by composer, so there's another really good one as long as you've got a big variety of songs here. You certainly can go by, these were all created by the same person, or their label, the artist label, the band label's the same. So that's where you've got composer. And albums. Albums are another really good way that most song names, for the most part, aren't that meaningful. But an album name could be more meaningful. Even though there's a song called Born in the USA, there's an album called Born in the USA. So great. You've got a hit song and the name of the album's the same. So therefore you've got, if you buy it, you get a dozen more songs, of which you're not sure what they're named, but that's fine. I like the overall concept, so I'm going to go in. So grouping around smaller groups, because a genre might be a large group and a small group might be an album, and the smallest is a song name. Artists also might be a larger grouping concept. So you've right in the beginning here, you've got grouping concepts which are essential, and you've already got some data to work with. So this is great. This came from a fairly reasonable data source. I've got another example though, and this is one of the things that we all, sorry everyone here who might be part of my network, but there was this thing once upon a time called a Rolodex. There was a thing once upon a time called contacts. You had to keep track of people's names, addresses, phone numbers, etc. So this happened to be one where just going through and downloading this from LinkedIn, and this is where things do get tricky, right? Because you have a lot of uniqueness here. The uniqueness is this person and this company and this job title, and maybe when you met them is probably a data set that will not help you at all, right? You're going to need some other organizational ideas to make this useful. Even LinkedIn itself, it does have difficulty other than date added, or maybe they're using that they may be using some other techniques to be able to organize data around your connections to other people. So let's leave it at that. But as an information architect, if you're given a list of names, such as a company directory, and you don't see anything like department or any grouping that you might be able to use later, that's when you want to start talking and having discussions with different constituents about the data model. hey, it's really hard to organize this stuff. I know it's useful for the computer. The computer's fine. It can do its job of identifying all these people. But what about if we wanted to do an org chart? How would we do that? How would we keep track of titles? That's another great thing, although I think titles in here. Titles might be a grouping exercise, but you need a company name, you need a title, you need well, I'm just thinking of a few off the top of my head with this data set that make it your job as an information architect to bring up these questions. How do I start to organize or deliver any value on this data within an interface if I can't group it, if I can't understand how they might relate to each other? And that would then be before you get into design itself. But let's just pretend you are designing. You're just kind of designing in your head right now. What you want are options. You need these things, grouping. You need, again, you're trying to structure the data in some sense. Let's just go back to this, that if you were given this person's desktop folder, how would you organize it? How would you let this person organize it is another really interesting challenge. So as an answer to that question, I'm just going to reveal, go to how Apple tried to handle that problem. And what they did is that they forced some kind of organization. And you can see they actually used the similar concepts that we came up with. They tried to come up with groups. So in this case, you've got images. And if you opened images, it's going to show you all the images. And this concept of a stack is an information architecture concept. Pretty cool, right? And this is kind of the long, hard battle to go from that one person's experience, which is that you can put anything you want on a desktop, that you can easily get overwhelmed and cluttered, and you don't want to, again, take all that time to try to figure it out. Another thing that they introduced recently is this idea of a stage manager, which is similar. Got a lot of open windows. Having them all open is very noisy and cluttered, but you can group them. So in this case, I'm shooting a video, I'm talking about things, and you can actually put these together. Brand new concept, might not last more than a few years, but we always, as trying to solve these problems for others, I always appreciate what people are trying to do. And every attempt is a way of learning whether or not this is going to be too much or too little structure. That oftentimes you're trying to find that nice sweet spot where people feel like they're in control and they don't have to conform to your organizational ideas. That is another topic we can talk about. But metaphorically, I hope it works. So you're looking for groups. You're looking for ways to take those groups and have as many different sizes of groups as possible. We'll get into in a couple videos later what do those words mean, because actually the words in grouping are a whole topic unto itself called taxonomies. But the next video, I do want to, so now I showed you that somehow miraculously I got a couple of data sets, but now I'm going to actually go into where do you really get data sets from? And you'll be surprised how many there are that are just lurking there for you to take and manipulate. And I'm also going to introduce a tool that I just think is much more about databases than Excel, or even what I was showing you is a more Excel clone in Apple called Numbers. It's called Airtable because it is a database, even though it might look like a spreadsheet. Let's call it that. Call it a day. It's going to be a fun topic, so I'll get to you in the next video.